Hello, this is Dr. Artie Storè, welcoming you to another lecture in our Introduction to Art History. Today, we'll be talking about the Carolingian Empire and their most important member, Charlemagne. Now, the Carolingians' rise comes as a result of the Merovingians' fall. The Merovingians, as you recall from our last lecture, were a German people who became what's known as the Franks, settling in Francia. Now the Merovingians had a dynastic problem, as the kings of the Merovingian Empire saw themselves as owning the land itself, and so giving it to their heirs in a piecemeal fashion, as you would in a will. Those heirs, unfortunately, would subsequently fight amongst themselves to re-establish their kingdom. So, in the 7th century, we see the rise of Charles Martel, who was, if you will, a chief of staff to one of the Merovingian rulers. And after his victory over the invading Muslims, became quite important indeed, and in fact his family became eventually the rulers of Francia. Now, Charlemagne's kingdom is a quite interesting one, principally because he was so enraptured with the Roman Empire, and especially the Christian Roman Empire. Charlemagne ruled from 768 to 814, and one of the most important events in the life of Charlemagne took place in Rome in December 24th, 800. It was there that Charlemagne was crowned Holy Emperor by the Pope Leo III. This makes Charlemagne in many respects an heir to Constantine and the Christian Roman emperors. It of course also set up an interesting dialogue between the emperors, the rulers of Europe, and the Pope, the spiritual leader of Europe. It also, of course, set up an interesting debate between Europe and its newly crowned emperor, and the Byzantine Empire, which of course, in their minds, had the one true emperor. This crowning did much to reinforce Charlemagne's authority over his diverse realm, and strengthen the bonds between the Pope in Rome and the secular government in the north. This also underlines Charlemagne's attempts to re-establish and restore a Western Roman Empire, and all that it entailed. And what it did entail, of course, is a return to Roman art forms. So let us start today by looking at some of those Roman art forms, and also picking up where we left off in our last lecture, talking about manuscript illuminations. Now, of course, to the right, you see another evangelist page from a gospel book. This gospel book, the Goodosok Gospels, is named after the monk who signed his name to the book, and it's thought to reflect many of the books that Charlemagne brought back with him from his many trips to Rome. This particular book is one of the earliest gospel books created in Charlemagne's scriptoria. The scriptoria, you recall from our last lecture, are the rooms in monasteries in which monks create these illuminated manuscripts. Most interesting to this gospel book is, of course, the image you see here, which shows a monumental enthroned Christ, whose large eyes directly engage the viewer and bring us into his world. His purple robes reveal that connection so sought by Charlemagne, connection to imperial royal power, because you recall that purple was the color for the Roman emperors. Notice, though, that this gospel book was produced some 19 years before he's proclaimed emperor. So he's already here looking and pulling in many sources of Roman influence. This work, though, shows even more of that Roman influence. This is St. Matthew, an evangelist page from the Coronation Gospels, also known as the Gospel Book of Charlemagne. It was called the Coronation Gospels because many of the later German emperors and kings swore on this book when they were coronated. This book was probably illuminated by a illuminator from either Italy or Byzantium, as we can see from the classical stylings of St. Matthew. Indeed, were it not for the large golden halo behind St. Matthew's head, we might say that this looks just like a classical portrait. Indeed, a classical portrait such as this of Menander that you see here, in the stool, wearing the Roman garb, reading a book. Much different, in fact, than this work, of course, from the Lindisfarne Gospels that we saw in our last lecture, with its flattened forms and heavy outlines. Here, we see a very classical-inspired St. Matthew. We see lots of modeling on the face and the robes. We see a weightiness to those robes and that body. And in fact, we do see the body underneath those robes. All things that are markers of Roman painting. This shows us the kind of work that Charlemagne was commissioning in his kingdom. And in fact, the official seal of Charlemagne's empire was Renovatio Romani Imperii, literally a renewal of the Roman Empire. One of the keys for Charlemagne to this renewal was the use of monks. In fact, Benedictine monks, of which we'll speak in a moment. These monks also produce work that is perhaps somewhat uncommon for Roman-inspired works, as we see here in this generation later gospel book, the Ebbo Gospels, the so-called Gospels of the Archbishop Ebbo of Reims. Here we see a Matthew who does not seem quite so solid as the Coronation Gospels, but a Matthew who seems to be enraptured with the Holy Spirit. The voice of God has perhaps overtaken Matthew, and now he's in a whirlwind of activity, writing his Gospel book. The marks that make up the robe do reveal quite a bit about the makeup of Matthew's body. We can see his thighs and his knees and his calves, but those lines also continue in the ground and in the hill behind him, as well as the decorative element on the border. Even this has some markings of those quick flame-like lines that make up St. Matthew. We also see this in other pages from the other Gospels. Here we have St. Mark, and of course you'll know that it's St. Mark, or you'll know that it's St. Matthew, thanks to the evangelist symbol, in this case, in the upper right corner. Here, of course, we have the lion of St. Mark, who will become quite important in later lectures, especially those on Venice. Now, these Gospel books were quite expensive, and many of them showed an enormous investment of time, of talent, of materials, and so just as the book was valuable, they were protected with equally valuable covers. These covers themselves were frequently recycled or even stolen. The cover to this book, the Lindau Gospels, was probably made between 870 and 880 at a monastic workshop of Charles the Bald, Charlemagne's grandson. But the cover was not made for this book. Sometime before the 16th century, it was reused on a late 9th century manuscript from the monastery of St. Gall. The figures themselves were created in repoussé, which is a type of hammering from the back to produce the three-dimensional modeling you see here. The figures themselves are surrounded by heavily jeweled frames, and these jewels were raised on miniature arcades to allow light reflected to pass underneath the jewels and even further highlight their radiance. What's interesting about this particular depiction of Christ that you see here on the Lindau Gospels is, of course, it's a Christ crucified, but it's not a Christ who's suffering, as perhaps you may have seen in depictions of later Christian work or perhaps Byzantine work, but rather it's a Christ triumphant over death. I mentioned a moment ago that the Lindau Gospel cover was created in a monastery called St. Gall. This is a plan of the Abbey of St. Gall, created around 800 CE. It was created by the abbot Hatio of the Renachau Abbey for Josper, the abbot of St. Gall, as an aid to the rebuilding of his monastery. It was meant to be a plan that Josper was able to adapt and take as he saw fit, and therefore we may see it as an ideal plan or a model plan to be adapted as he saw fit. Here we have a slightly better depiction of this plan that hopefully you can read. You'll notice that the plan is quite regular, and divided into a series of almost module-like forms, with the abbey church at its center. Attached to this abbey church, which is a very basic form of church called the Basilican church, featuring two apses, or rounded ends, one on each side. Unlike typical Basilican churches, you'll note that there is no large open space in the nave, but rather a series of smaller altars designed for use by the monks. This, of course, highlights a difference between churches for monastic use and churches for the laity or the non-monks. You'll also notice that right underneath, at least in this view of the plan, right underneath the abbey church is a cloister, a large enclosed area for meditation. You'll also notice lots of other rooms designed for the self-sufficiency of the monastery, as well as areas for visitors to stay but be sequestered from the monks who had very particular timetables. These monks were Benedictines, and I, or your teacher, will have more to say on the various orders of monks in coming lectures, but let me say now that the Benedictines were named after Benedict of Nursia, who created a rule for monasteries, a guideline, if you will, for monastic life. Monasteries had been quite popular with Christians from the beginning of Christianity, but many people who went to monasteries ended up living, if you will, lives of luxury and abundance rather than meditation and prayer. And so, in the 6th century, Benedict created this rule that focused on celibacy, poverty, obedience to the abbot, prayer, manual labor, the cultivation of land primarily, as well as caring for the sick, and also a vow of stability, so that people wouldn't just come and go in a couple of weeks. This, of course, will cause monasteries to become quite more self-sufficient and quite more dominant in the coming centuries. This model, of course, gives us quite a view of what early medieval monasteries would have been like. One of the most important things that I want you to notice is the two towers toward the left side of the abbey church. Now these towers we can see here in our model. Remember, of course, that this particular plan was never actually built, so all we can see really would be a model of what this particular plan would have ended up like. But you'll notice the two large towers here, which probably could have been seen from many miles away in the flat low country, marking this area as a monastery, much the same way perhaps as minarets would have marked mosques and the land as Muslim. Now, let us return, of course, to Charlemagne and his rule, and his return of Roman power. Now, Charlemagne visited Rome and Ravenna many times as a boy with his father, and became enamored of Theodoric, the first Germanic Roman emperor. In this particular depiction, you'll notice an equestrian portrait of Charlemagne, or perhaps this is his grandson again, Charles the Bald, and he is depicted in much the way that we would see an emperor from Rome depicted. In fact, this was modeled after an equestrian portrait of Theodoric that Charlemagne actually brought back with him to his capital at Aachen, in what's now Germany. That equestrian portrait has since been lost, but of course we can trace this back to an even further model, an equestrian portrait of Marcus Aurelius, which we see here. Now, the reason that we have an equestrian portrait of an emperor, as your teacher may have told you, is because Christians believe this to be a depiction of Constantine, the first Christian emperor, and not in fact Marcus Aurelius. Lucky for us, they were wrong. You'll notice then that the depiction of the equestrian portrait of Charlemagne is much simpler, much more direct, much less detailed than the portrait of Marcus Aurelius on the right. You'll also notice that rather than having, perhaps say, armor or a Roman toga, Charlemagne, or Charles the Bald, wears heavy imperial robes, and rather than holding his arm out in dominion of the world, as Marcus Aurelius does, Charlemagne sits as if on parade. Now, he does hold in his left hand an orb symbolizing dominion, but it's of a much simpler and more direct kind. You'll also note that the depiction of Charlemagne is much smaller. This is really a tabletop depiction of the emperor, quite possibly one that could have been moved from place to place for particular ritual or ceremonial purposes, but it does show, at least on this small scale, a return, not only in depictions of Roman forms, as we've seen in the Coronation Gospels, but also in sculpture, to Roman forms and Roman ideals. It also shows us that even though we're in the Middle Ages, there are still connections, still associations to the Roman Empire. And none of those could be clearer than Charlemagne's chapel and his palace at Aachen. Unfortunately, most of the palace itself has been remodeled and been altered heavily, but we can still look to the Palatine Chapel, his personal private chapel, and see clear connections to a much earlier Roman building, and by that I refer, of course, to San Vitale in Ravenna. As I mentioned, Charlemagne, along with his father, visited Ravenna, and Charlemagne revisited Ravenna many times after he became ruler of the Franks. And so he modeled his particular chapel after that building, with its octagonal shape and its arches and columns. And in fact, he actually invited many Italian and Byzantine architects and stonemasons to his palace to build this, importing porphyry and marble along the way. Now you'll notice a number of changes, of course. For instance, the columns in the middle of the arches hold no actual structural purpose, but they do create kind of a wonderful decorative element to the chapel, bringing our eye ever upwards to the vault, the first vaulted church in Northern Europe in the Middle Ages. And also, we see the glorious sumptuousness of this particular interior. Charlemagne, who, at least if reports are to be true, not only spoke Frankish, but also Latin and Greek, attempted a strict revision of Latin, which he felt had decayed somewhat since Roman times. Now, of course, this canonization of Latin at the time really did do a number of things. One, it began the break that we have today where Latin is no longer a spoken language. And two, it really began to isolate those things that had changed in Latin since the Romans and began pushing us on a course towards languages such as Spanish and French becoming separate and distinct from Latin. It also, though, made numerous revisions to the Bibles which were being produced in scriptoria around the Frankish area and helped to clean up errors in those Bible writings. Here we see a depiction of Charlemagne's throne, which had been in the gallery just above the altar. This way allowing Charlemagne to sit on his throne and see the altar, as well as people coming in from the narthex. Charlemagne takes with him then not only ideas about Roman and Byzantine building styles, but also their ideas for galleries and second stories, as well as kind of imperial chapels. Here we see a drawing cutting away so we can see just how the Palatine Chapel looks, the second story galleries, where you would have had connections not only for his throne, but also a connection right to his palace, as well as the dome above. The outside of the Palatine Chapel has been heavily modelled and changed, as I mentioned, but it would have looked something similar to this. This is the Abbey Church of Corvey in Germany, and it features what we now call a westwork. A westwork would have been kind of an enlarged narthex, or entry into the church, featuring numerous stories, sometimes having, if you will, a church inside of a church, or chapels for particular rituals. Here, though, and of course, we're only looking at the lower portion of this westwork. The upper portion, you'll notice, has a slightly different stonework just above the arcade in the center. This you can safely ignore, as this was added a couple of centuries later. These would have contained large stairs leading up to the top, and of course, you can also see that this leads to, if any of you have ever noticed or seen medieval churches, Romanesque or Gothic churches, with their large spires and towers, directly to this. So we see a transition, a change from the small single-story narthexes to these grand entrances. Now, Charlemagne dies in 814, and as his other sons had died earlier, his entire empire passes safely to his one remaining son, Louis the Pious. And so we have a very smooth and uneventful transition of power. Unfortunately, when Louis the Pious himself dies in 840, he leaves his empire to his 3 remaining sons, and the empire is split between them, becoming the divisions that you see here, and starting, of course, are divisions that will ultimately become France and Germany. Now, in the next lecture, we'll look at some of these divisions and see how the arts of one of them, Germania, leads to our next period of medieval art, the Artonians. Until then, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention, and please keep an eye on art. Until next time, thank you.